Hi, Rosa.
Hi, Karim. How are you?
I'm doing all right. It's been a long week, but looking forward to a little bit of rest this weekend. How are you? How's your week been going so far?
In the similar boat of a lot of things happening all at the same time, and looking forward to a little respite, but really looking forward to chatting with you today. It was kind of like the ice cream Sunday at the end of the week, ice cream Friday.
I've never been compared to an ice cream sundae before, but I will take that as a compliment. And also, same. I've been looking forward to this too. Um, but I know you as one of Colloqate's board members, but other folks who are maybe tuning into this may not know you. So you were really gracious enough to, having watched our first shop talk, be interested in joining for another one. Will you introduce yourself to folks just a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what brought you to the board of Colloqate and this movement?
Sure. Where do I start? I will just start maybe with where I am professionally today, and then give a little reminder background for those that don't know who I am. So Rosa Sheng, I am currently working at SmithGroup as a vice president, higher education studio leader, and I also hold the privileged position as national director of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And the acronym JEDI might be spelled out from those words, but they have a specific order and a specific meaning that actually Brian Seeley Jr. and myself, as cohorts in the movement, developed together. Because as you know now, with the words D, E, and I, or DI or EDI being under scrutiny or uh, subrogation by the current administration. Um, we originally had discussed how things were not advancing at the rate and desire of the demands or the idealisms that we believed in. And then in a lot of reading at that time, especially pre-pandemic, but then even more so post-pandemic, justice, you can't get the equity, even diversity and inclusion, without leading with justice, which is the recognition of systems of harm and oppression.
Mhm.
And with that agreement, it was around the same time that Brian founded Colloqate and asked me and several others that were in that thought leadership group together and activism to come together to support him. So we gladly were very enthusiastic about doing that. Some people might remember me for founding Equity by Design, which was originally called the Missing 32%. The group is an activist group, a little dormant today, but the recognition was conducting a series of national surveys that were meant to highlight the inequities of the profession of architecture and design, and to allow that kind of open source information, the data from the research, to empower people to advocate for change in the systems of inequitable workplace that dealt with compensation, that dealt with advancement, retention, recruitment, all the things, right? And even the act of getting work. And that movement has evolved throughout the years, especially with the tragedies of the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor at the time, but obviously layers and layers more of people and names and systems of that that really had that call to action of urgency. I hope that's a good starting point, but the
Yeah,
arc of the movement and why we use the term JEDI, or justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, is still relevant
yeah,
today in the work, regardless of the backlash or the misunderstanding of that work.
absolutely. Uh, I kind of can't believe we never talked about all of this before, but I mean, we're always doing a lot of things. So I am again grateful to have the chance to kind of dig into it with you
Thank you.
here. Um, Yeah, and a couple of things that just stood out to me as you were sharing all of that is like it's not um accidental or uh even like just an afterthought that what we're seeing in terms of this attack on movements for justice is starting with uh, attacking the language that we use to even describe the movements in the most basic way. Not even like justice, right? Like justice is not even a discussion point. It's DEI as the discussion point, as though that is somehow an oppressive and offensive and like anti-white term, right? And then attacking sources of data that would enable us to track where we've been and where we're trying to go. So the point that you were just making about data and gathering data as a means of um, informed decision making towards change, towards systemic change. It just re-emphasizes the power and importance of that and why it is a target, like why organizations and universities and all these kinds of spaces that do that kind of data tracking are, or even federal government data sources are being scrubbed so that we can't act on good information. Um,
Definitely. Yeah.
when we were chatting a little bit before I hit record and thinking about what you were, working on recently, um, you mentioned education and that being central to your practice as a design professional. And so that also feels like a natural segue and connection from like the research side of things and like movement building and how that shows up in education spaces and design of education spaces. So what's been on your mind lately as it comes to designing spaces for education in this moment?
Yes. There are definitely layers and scales of impact, and I think I will focus more on the design and the spatial impacts of thinking in a certain way, but maybe I could paint the context for everyone in a bigger picture. Um, Even in our current times when we feel overwhelmed, when we feel out of control, where we feel at risk and endangered as just our livelihood, our ability to thrive is being put at risk.
Mhm,
And I think in order to ground ourselves out of paralysis, because part of the whole um, action, for lack of a better term, that's happening right now feels like the goal is paralysis and fear.
mhm,
And so if we recenter ourselves on hope, the opposite of these things, and empowerment and the concept of abundance, it's been talked about a lot more recently as a theme of coming together, and also just zooming back out. What we've witnessed over the past several years is actually a disintegration of our social networks
mhm,
and factualism and data, as you've mentioned before, as a way to equalize and bring knowledge and advancement, right? But in that mindset of abundance, there are ways that we can, in our own small little drop, and I call this eating a whale, which is a gross analogy, but it was more from a poem of
mhm,
a figurative concept of each person doing their part,
mhm,
right? So eating the whale means each person doing their part. And in this concept of abundance, if we are generous, things that we can do naturally, if we can from just listening to somebody, being like a mental advocate, soothing somebody who is in fear or anxiety, who is in loneliness, as just simple company as a starting point. And then if we wanted to scale that up, um, of building these social networks, rebuilding these social networks, the offering of food, the sharing of food, even though we might individually not have an abundance to feed a whole group that is in need, if we bring our resources together, imagine what we could achieve.
mhm,
Um, and going back to knowledge is power, empowerment, to bring people out of poverty and the dire conditions and risks of their health and livelihood. Education has always been one of my belief systems, that if you teach somebody to fish, it's better, than giving the fish, but then giving them access to where to fish, right, is where it's, yes, that's part of the conundrum, right? And so as my role, going back to the role of where I am in the profession, I have the opportunity to be a connector and advocate for the one of the most vulnerable populations, not only at risk people and intersectional identities, but students, those trying to advance their education knowledge, that threshold between adolescence and adulthood, and all the investment that they're trying to make in that future being subject to disintegration, right, and hopelessness. And so in the there's a lot I've been studying about spatial belonging, or the impacts of dignity, belonging, and just access to resources in spatial context to one's ability to persist. And a student's ability to learn how to persist is not just getting good grades and getting a degree, but it's learning that persistence also transitions into resilience in terms of what will help them succeed throughout life and not giving up. And that's a greater message to us all, to not give up. But how do we pay that forward to the next generation? And in that teaching of that, how do we rebuild those broken networks in society? Another concept is propinquity. I don't know if you've heard of that before. Somebody shared that with me last year, but I've been using it as my word of the year. The word has two definitions. One is about kinship and kin making, whether that is a blood bond or if that is chosen relationships, chosen family. But the act of kin making is something that has to be active and reproduce constantly. But at the same time, it is, the second part of the definition is the proximity. So the more proximity, or the more frequency you are in that proximation to others, the natural ability to become closer to someone, to develop those kin keeping bonds in architecture, in space, is an important part of society. And when we went away because of COVID, a lot of those kin making opportunities were broken, and had the opportunity for all the internet data, etc., to cause doubt, questioning of the truth, false narratives, and the further erosion of trust. And so I think about that word propinquity as a fundamental part of our architecture practice, the practice of making spaces that promote propinquity.
I love that term. Thank you for gifting it to me and to everyone else who may not have heard it before. Yeah, so much of what there's so much in what you just said that's like pinging in my brain. But I think like one thing that's fresh on my mind right now, I'm honing in on the kin making notion. And the idea of a term that I was introduced to recently through a book, Everything for Everyone, which I really recommend. Familying, like basically the idea of like family as a verb, right? And that, like we're familiar with it already in so many ways, and in different cultures like that, the family or the kin that you have is not necessarily just by birth or by like direct relationship, but we construct it, and we constantly construct it, and it is really hard to maintain a sense of kinship with people that you don't have proximity to.
Right.
But when you do have proximity to people, like I'm thinking about the structures that we live in all the time, and structures meaning like our workplaces, even, or the schools that we go to. That doesn't necessarily mean that those structures are designed for us to build kinship, right?
Right.
Um, and they are designed. And so,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, I'm curious, specifically thinking about students, and as you mentioned, like the vulnerability of students, but also the power of students. Like I'm 36, so I'm not a youth anymore, but it still feels a little weird to me to talk about young people. Um, but I recognize I'm not in high school or college. You know, I have a kid of my own now, so I see the ways that people who are even just like 5, 10 years younger than me have energy for movement work and have space for movement work and the relationship building that's necessary for that, that like is really hard to hold when you're, you know, doing a job and you're not in a
Yes.
learning mode and environment all the time, where your learning is like about your own growth and not just towards a product or towards a deadline or towards a deliverable. So how do you think about the role of designer, of architect, um, in creating spaces for kin making in education?
I think the foundation is authenticity and vulnerability. Transitioning from ourselves solely as professionals, but trying to bring our authentic selves and that authenticity of belief and practice, it goes beyond the transactional, but it also has to, um, I would say, not just be about ourselves. I like to use these little simple summaries, but from me to we.
Hmm.
So while we need to self-care and think of ourselves as survivors of a vessel, right, which we walk about the earth in, the power of we and the collective, the coalition building, the cohort making, the kin keeping, the power of us is so much more than the individual. And I see myself as a connector of people as well as just an individual, superhero. I am not really a superhero. I'm more of a connector of ideas, or witnessing a problem and then ideating a solution that comes out of building those connections of multiple people to solve a particular complex issue. So the complex issue in my context on a daily basis is higher education, and um, a I guess a preconceived notion that in order to get ahead, you have to get an elite higher education, you have to get a degree from an Ivy League, or a reputable institution, a four-year institution that has a reputation, that you can't, achieve the same rich enrichment or level of knowledge building in a community college as somewhat of a falsehood. Um, and also being in California, I've witnessed the amazing systems of community colleges and the public education systems in different ranges and scales, but at the base is that nothing about us without us,
Mhm.
from me to we, the student as the client,
Mhm.
is something that these institutions are at least at a common ground starting point.
Mm.
But there's still the histories of harm and oppression, that are, and the evidence of that system of harm and oppression that are in literally the architecture that we have built in the past, which
Right.
has been bottom dollar, get it done quickly. These students are only going to be here for 2 years, so why invest in the architecture that they're going to go through,
Yeah.
etc. From that commodity mindset, transactional mindset, profit capitalist mindset, to a more socially driven, connectedness and holistic well-being mindset, right?
Mhm.
And that access that everybody deserves to have access to education as a human right, in addition to the other human rights that we, co-advocate for.
Yeah. I mean, we're sitting here talking and I'm nodding because like I agree education should be a human right, just like healthcare should be a human right, housing should be a human right. Um, and and at the same time we're living in a country that doesn't, by its demonstrated actions, believe in any of those things, and in fact is like working systemically um, at multiple levels in different parts of this continent to make sure that people don't have access to any of that, not as a right or even as an option. Um, and I'm going to reflect a little bit about some of what we've been seeing and experiencing in Colloqate as we are like talking to folks and looking for work and reaching out and looking at RFPs and stuff. And like even here in Portland, which is where I'm based, which has this reputation as a very liberal to progressive city, there is currently like a active softening or stepping back from what were some really firm, at least verbal commitments
Yes,
to addressing generations of harm and injustice within education systems here from like the K-12 level through higher ed and community colleges. And I understand why, because we're seeing the scale and the like um, ferocity of attack coming from the federal government. Even here in Portland, the Portland Public Schools is currently being sued by the federal government or having a Title IX case brought against them um, because a trans athlete, a student, was participating in a track meet and someone reported that, right, as a way to the federal government as a way of attacking trans youth. And I can't say I don't sit in the seat of a system administrator like that, right? And to their absolute credit, like the district has put out lots of statements saying like they stand by their values and their commitments to supporting trans youth and the broader queer community. But like you're kind of talking about this a little earlier, as an individual, it's difficult. And as an individual institution, it's difficult to stand up to the onslaught. Um, and we really need to see and build coalitions that are like capitulation isn't an option, because you can't give an inch and expect that it's going to stop there, right?
right.
So I'm interested to hear if you have any like reflections from your experience on where some of the like systems barriers are
Yes,
within higher education and like placemaking and architecture in higher education to like foregrounding justice as like
yes,
the driving factor, um, and then also like how you work through or around or with those barriers to keep pushing for systems change.
definitely. Oh, where do I start?
Good question.
um, Maybe we start at the root, which is tuition, right? Let's start with things that are not architectural. So, but we could translate to what that equals in an architectural environment ultimately, because if somebody has to pay a certain amount for tuition, whatever the amount is,
Mhm.
that's money, whether, you know, one could say, well, you should have saved up for it or what have you, depending on the um, those that have generational wealth issues, etc. Let's just, give empathy to a context that people might not understand. You could save up and you can scrimp up all you want to pay for that tuition, but then there's housing, then there's basic needs, food, then there's transportation, then there's the utility bills, right? So everything that somebody would normally be able to get by and pay for, if they're trying to get a leg up, the cognitive dissonance is the effort for somebody who wants to get out of poverty or being income challenged. They're basically gambling and rolling the dice, putting that money that they would put into daily living and survival into tuition that is increasing at a frightening rate every year. And then, so if they invest in an institution, one hope that the institution would see that investment and handle that student with care. And what does care mean? Making sure that they are not only recruited, but that they're retained and that they have a pathway of persistence. And what I mean by a pathway of persistence is not only saying, oh, but we have all these resources of tutoring, et cetera, but if a student doesn't feel comfortable in the environment, or they don't even know if the resource exists, then they are at risk of not believing, being overcome with the self-doubt or the burden of the financial burden to begin with, of is this even worth putting myself into debt? And what's the likelihood I'm going to make it through this system that already doesn't serve me? So part of it is the architecture. So we take that as a general premise that they're cash strapped in a very simple everyday term. They are cash strapped. They're coming to your institution. They need a place to study. They may have commuted a long time to get to your institution, or if you're a commuter college, there is no place for them to reside. Your housing costs or lack thereof affordable housing causes them to commute. When they get to your academic building, how do you welcome them? Is there a place to sit? Are they sitting on the floor because you did not trust them or provide them with furniture? Or maybe there's a code by the fire marshal which says, keep the building safe, but you interpret it as keep the hallways empty because furniture equals burning furniture or no safety. So you interpret it a certain way and therefore have a unfortunately hostile environment to somebody who's coming in as a student. So not only do they have to learn the material, study for the exams, but they're braving it with this long commute, finding a place to get affordable food. If they've brought food or they have special needs for food, where to store it, how to warm it up. If they have special needs and they're neurodiverse, places to come and focus. If they're transgender, a place to use the restroom. All these things signify whether or not a person is validated or supported, even if we don't think so. And then people take for granted windows, natural light and views, and enough of that, because again, when we go to the transactional, what's going to cost the least, what's going to be the most efficient, the interpretation of that is, let's get rid of all the most expensive materials. That's glass. That's daylight, views to the outside, right? But what is the impact of that on learning? Nobody ever does that life cycle cost analysis of education, right? Or the embodied deficiency, let's say, of the lack of being super efficient. And it comes to lack of attention span, confusion or disorientation in being in spaces. Like if people have watched Severance, because that's one of the current popular shows, I'll just describe that it's in a basement, it's a workplace, and it's a maze of the hallways are a maze. So the fluorescent lighting, harsh lighting, and people have been in those spaces, and when you're trapped in a windowless room, or you go to a movie and you come out of that movie, you're disoriented. Your body feels strange. It's disconnected from its circadian rhythm. How are you supposed to learn if you're stressed under these conditions? And maybe just a reminder of brain function that people may or may know about. You've heard the term fight or flight. It's when the sensory around you is telling you that an environment is hostile or dangerous to you. The creative or learning part of your brain actually shuts off because your adrenaline kicks in. That part of your brain is asking you to react, right? And the creative part, the thinking part, anything that collects and retains knowledge cannot do that under those conditions.
Yeah.
So observing the aged buildings, we have this great, at the same time that this is the current condition of a lot of aged institutions, there is an opportunity to create, not redesign buildings and just put new buildings there with the same conditions, but actually undo these systems of harm and oppression for learning. And thinking about them navigationally, can somebody not only be attracted to a building for curiosity, but once they get into a building, know exactly where they're going because they're reoriented by views to the outside where they might see other buildings to tell them I'm going in the right direction. Obvious stairwells or elevators adjacent to each other. That natural daylight, that time of day, that's makes such a fundamental difference at that base level. And then layers on top of that in the actual learning environments like the classrooms or in between the classrooms. Is it an active learning environment where there are smaller groups and team-based learning cohorts? Can the furniture be moved around easily to even enable that? Or is it the traditional lecture format where there's a singular voice of authority in the room and it's the majority is just dissemination and not collaboration or exchange, where knowledge is probably more powerful or retained longer when there is that applied learning, demonstration, or debate or discourse. And yeah, and in between, lastly, I'll just say this and then definitely tell me what you think. The sticky spaces where people make friends, where there's a new term also that I learned called productive struggle, where the act of learning is hard. It is hard work, but seeing other people, witnessing other people going through that struggle and knowing that there is hope in a positive outcome in that investment of that struggle. That is the magic of the spaces that we could create. How do we create spaces and what types of spaces support production struggle? We've interviewed students that talked numerously about marker boards being in the hallways so that they're not just writing or taking notes or doing formulas in their notebooks, but they're showing others, they're demonstrating, they're solving together what somebody can't figure out by just writing it out in public and then being vulnerable to writing it and getting it wrong and then trying again.
Yeah. I'm having like a lot of flashbacks to my college experience.
Sorry.
No, it's good. Honestly, I reflect on it often being in this industry. Like I went to the University of Oregon. I studied landscape architecture, and a lot of the things that a lot of the things that you just described were resonating for me, including like the financial barrier. I mean, I'm privileged to come from a middle class family that had, and I'm not a first generation higher education student, but I'm the only person in my immediate family, my parents or my younger siblings, who doesn't have a master's degree. And part of that was timing of the pandemic and like had been saving up to go to grad school. And then the pandemic hit. And I was like, well, I have this and I'm not going anywhere. And it took me a while to like save up this amount. And now I have a partner. And so like it's grad school or a down payment, you know, and that was the direction that we went in. And I'm grateful for that too. But it shouldn't have to be a choice, right? Like no one should have to make a call between can I afford a stable place to live or my education? And for a lot of people, it's even more like dire than just you know, being able to put a down payment down on a house, if that's even an option. It's like, can I afford to eat or go to school? Can I
Wow.
afford childcare or going to school, right? And it is such a barrier. And then you know, all the things that you're laying out, I mean, being in the architecture school and landscape architecture school at the U of O, and since then, I don't know if it was a trend, but like, why are so many design schools brutalist architecture? Like,
Yes.
the worst, it is the most hostile learning environment that you can imagine. It feels like going into a bunker. You're in a program that makes you like essentially go underground for days on end to produce towards these deadlines. And then like it feels bad to be in those spaces. It takes a toll on your body.
Yes.
You
Yes.
know,
Absolutely.
so I think, and we had those productive struggle spaces that we created for ourselves. And I think that's like something that I always try to emphasize with folks who are not in the design field professionally is like, people do design all the time, right? You don't have to be trained as an architect or a designer to do placemaking work and to create meaningful spaces. It's a human endeavor. It's a social endeavor, but like the 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 fact that you're fighting against your body shutting down and your creative learning like capacity being diverted towards, oh my god, this is the most uncomfortable stool I've sat on in my life, you know, or
Yes.
feel culturally out of uh, disconnected or isolated, and like the source material might not even be like um, responding to your culture or your heritage or like lessons that you could relate to directly, like all of that environment, which, you know, gets dismissed as like, oh, we're coddling students by creating safe spaces or whatever. Actually, like, it's neuroscience, right? It's biology. It's like we learn better in environments where we feel, where our parasympathetic nervous system can kick in, and we're not creating those environments, which is a cultural endeavor as much as it is like just on the aesthetics or the, you know, furnishing and equipment. And so we're going to engage in productive struggle no matter what, but we shouldn't be designing spaces that force students and faculty and teachers, educators to struggle against their own system responses, right?
Unproductive struggle.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Or this notion of excessive toil as the ultimate virtue. And that's something I deal with as like a chronic thing that I learned, you know, that our generation, the previous generations have learned,
Mhm.
right? And that's been handed down,
Yeah.
that to exert yourself or to give up, you know, whatever just natural tendency to be human and to take care of your own body is signifying virtue,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
It's just strange to me, but um the undoing of that takes a long time. It's a mindset shift, it's cultural norms, right? It's practice, it's
Mhm.
behaviors, and the yeah.
But that's also a place where, I mean, were mentioning this a little bit before, like that is a place where we as workers in the design field can be strong advocates. Like we're interfacing with these client institutions if we work in public projects in any capacity, but especially education, um, or even like civic projects like libraries. You know, like when I talk to students or family members of students, um, the things that people want in order to make a space feel inclusive and hospitable are cultural representation and reflection, and and the things that we do across cultures are cook and eat food together, rest together, tell stories together, and like providing a kitchen and showers and like basic hygiene, like does it create an administrative headache? Because like then institutions have to figure out how to staff or maintain those spaces. Yes, in the way that these institutions are set up currently. But if you're a commuter campus or you're expecting people to be spending long hours learning and investing in their education and in your institution, and then you're not even providing people a place to rest, and you're saying exert yourself, produce, 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 but you don't get to bathe. You don't get to take a nap, and except for that gross couch in the corner, you know, like,
Yes.
and I think that is a place where, I mean, you tell me what you think about this, but I do see that as a place where we can move the needle because we can point to spatial typologies that and precedents where like this is happening already. It's not new. We're not introducing something new. Um,
Yes.
yeah, I wonder what you think
And
about.
part of it is dignity too, in that students are not a commodity. Students are not a, you know, not, they are deserving of quality materials, of materials or furniture that support their comfort, right? And it's this fascinating observance of what happens when you take uh, the intimate spaces of the home, and then you try to bring that into a public setting, in public architecture, right? And a public institution.
Mhm,
Um, that has been an exploratory journey. We've actually been pretty successful and fortunate in the last couple of projects
mhm,
to get couches that look like they could be in a, you know, hospitality environment or even a workplace environment. I think we inadvertently have the workplace to thank for that, because there was this in between of people bringing furniture into workspaces and making it feel more home like,
mhm,
right? Or even hotels and conference centers to feel more home like. So there was evidence of bringing home into and comfort into public spaces, but somehow it stopped short, at least, you know, 5 to 10 years ago, of being in and not just one check the box, there's the couch at
mhm,
the lobby, but where is the abundance of comfortable furniture, seating, and ergonomic and those complementary resources that signify home, right? Because ultimately that sense of belonging starts at home.
mhm,
And when we go out in the world, it is sadly a hostile environment because it is public. And the sad thing about things being public is that it's nobody's
mhm,
thing to take care of, right? Or there's people that are designated to take care of it, but then they're not compensated well to take care of it,
mhm,
to be stewards, right? So part of that I think is also tied to stewardship, that if you design a space of quality, of dignity, of these um, humanistic benefits, that people will take care of it because they feel a connection to it and they become stewards of that resource and they are responsible. So part of this theory is observing once you put the comfortable furniture in, or you put the thing that people say, oh, that's just going to get beaten up or dirtied by the students who don't care. We've actually been able to see the opposite of that, is that when you put the nicer furniture in, it signals a different way of behaving,
mhm,
that the nicer furniture also signifies to the user that you do care about them. We've interviewed students that said, when I walked into this building and I saw the nice furniture and all these nice study spaces, I actually thought seriously that I should be taking my, you know, academic journey seriously because they're investing in me.
mhm.
That was
Yeah,
like a magic statement to hear from, you know, somebody who didn't feel that before, just
yeah.
by those simple things. One might think, oh, that's just a couch to somebody.
It
Yeah.
feels it feels obvious. So much of this does feel obvious if you think about it as just like a person and not as um, and not with all of the like baggage of bureaucratic decision making, right?
Right, right.
Oh yeah, obviously I feel good when enter an environment that feels like it was created with my comfort and like inclusion in mind. Uh,
Yes,
yeah, yeah. Um, you mentioned stewardship too, and I think there's the one piece that I would add to that too is like it's and you're not saying this, but like you're describing the end result of like when we do these when we take these design measures that create beauty and comfort and like dignified spaces for people. And what I've observed and what I always try to emphasize is like the co-creative process of like having people who are going to use these spaces, even if they're students and they'll graduate and they'll move on, if they were part of making a place,
yes,
they can see their hand in it, then that is like, I care about a place that I make, right?
yes, yes,
And then like I'm more motivated to bring my kin, the people that are in my life in meaningful ways, back to that place to because I'm proud of it and
yes.
it will have meaning to me that I want them to carry as well or like feel um, that level of attachment to and sometimes that is outside of the this is just an observation but like sometimes that is outside of the intended use cases, right? Like you might, I'm not encouraging anyone to go and do this, but like you might find that piece of furniture that like uh on the back of that wooden panel or something, like someone carved their initials in the year that they graduated, but that
Yes,
becomes a site of ritual over and over, which isn't a sign of disrespect or lack of care. Like if and
it's
if
a
you
connection. Yeah,
right, it's a connection, and we can design for like experiences like that that don't create a maintenance headache because it's built in that there's a place for people to continue to make their mark, right?
intentionality and agency. Absolutely. That that connection to place has such a long-lasting power to it, and one's formative identity of who you are. Like the passage through an institution isn't just, again, that degree, it's that formative liminal transition from who that person is as a youth to who that person is or becoming as an adult, right? And that becoming has a spatial canal, if you will, for lack of a better term.
Mhm. I like that. Um, okay, well, you've been really generous with your time today. Before we kind of end it for now, but I hope we do this again. Um, do you have any calls to action or like resources that you would want to share with folks who watch this?
Yes, I think low hanging fruit would be uh, get to know a student in your community, whether it's a high school student, whether it's pre-K, whether it's college. Connect with somebody who is a student because I think the proximity to them and their curiosity and their energy and they're just not as jaded or pessimistic about the world. And we tend to get pessimistic when we're bombarded with the negative, but just having that proximity, we're doing student interviews and videos right now post occupancy of the buildings, and that exuberance, that hope, the magic, the gratefulness, the graciousness of even though that they're going through a lot of struggles, that just being offered a new resource, changed their perspective. And I am so grateful that I've had this opportunity to get to know them and to help tell their story. So part two is advocate, not just get to know them, but what do they need? And is there something very simple, even if it's just a new backpack, or maybe it's, you know, some other resource that they don't have, they need to learn,
Mm.
to be able to donate a laptop,
Mm.
provides, or if you can't donate a laptop, figure out if your company can do some kind of connection or advocacy program with an institution where there's student needs.
Mm. Thank you. Yeah, I'll build on that briefly and say, like, organizations or types of organizations that I've seen here, but in other communities as well. Like, I know sometimes it feels for people who aren't involved in community-based organizations who are in this industry, they're like, my work is my avenue towards contributing, but like if I don't work at a firm that does this kind of project, then I don't have access. It's like, if you have kids or kids in your life already, there's a connection. If you have a school PTSA, parent teacher student association, that is open to community members, like, and you're in some way connected to that, like, you can join that group. If there are local advocacy organizations focused on youth and
Absolutely.
students, like, be a
And
resource, right?
I forgot to mention time. If you are good at something, tutoring a student in math, something that they find difficult, time is the most precious gift, and you spending time with that student will, that's priceless. That's like confidence building. That's that connection making, that even if you did have the money to give resources, time is actually more of a precious resource to give. Thank you.